Hi, I'm Reed Peterson, and welcome to Grief Refuge. Thanks for listening today and trusting Grief Refuge as a resource to help navigate your grief and help you cope with loss. If this is your first time listening, welcome. And if you've listened before, welcome back. Grief Refuge, it's about helping you find peace and purpose after experiencing a death-related loss. This podcast was created with the intention to help validate everything that you're going through, to help you take time to reflect, and also for you to have space to honor your loved one. Here at Grief Refuge, you will learn healthy ways to manage grief. You can also find comfort, hopefulness, and a sense of peace in regards to your loss, as well as finding a way to embrace life and move forward again. Through the stories and conversations shared on this podcast, my intention is to help you work through the heavier, more painful feelings that usually show up when you're grieving. Grief is hard and it is painful. I'm glad you're here, and I promise to do everything I can to provide the best support to you. Before we get started, I want to mention a couple important points. Because of the depth and the nature of this topic, it may actually be more beneficial for you to not multitask while you're listening. Instead, feel invited to use this time for your self-care and your personal reflection. Feel invited to use this time to settle in, to relax, and to allow your grief-related feelings to run their course. If anything, feel invited to use this time to mourn your loss. Also, this podcast publishes episodes twice a month. And when you're grieving, that's a lot of time in between each episode to feel support. So you may need more resources. If you're in a place of needing more support right now, I strongly encourage you to download the Grief Refuge app. The Grief Refuge app helps provide comfort and support on a daily basis. On the Grief Refuge app, there are daily mini podcasts that can help validate your grief. They give you perspective, and they help you sort through the thoughts and the feelings that come up when dealing with loss and grief. The Grief Refuge app, it's pretty easy to find. All you need to do is search it on your phone's app store, and then you can download it for free. Thank you, and let's move on to today's topic. So life throws you a lot of curveballs. But those curveballs, they seem even more tumultuous when you're grieving. Today, I welcome Shelley Knight, and she shares her story about the loss of her stepfather, who she nicknamed Badger, and how it impacted her to leave her nursing career, go back into the field of education, and also write a book for grieving people. The book is titled Good Grief, the A to Z approach of modern day grief healing. Please enjoy the conversation and the full interview. Hi, Shelley. Welcome to Grief Refuge. It's such a joy to have you here with us.
Bless you. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. Well, on the Grief Refuge podcast, we really tend to focus on providing experiences of like sanctuary, quality time so that people can really tap into some of their own grief, just create that sacred space for it. And so that's the intention I'm hoping to set with you today in our conversation. Does that sound good to you?
Yeah, no, I love that. I love the way you said tap in, because I think people try and speed through grief, don't they? Or bury it. So I think tapping in is beautiful.
Yeah, I often hear in the US, I often hear the word conquer, or defeat. It's almost like, hey, I want to get through grief as soon as possible, and therefore I've overcome it or I've conquered it. And I'm like, ooh, if it's a one-to-one type of setting, I often think to myself, we've got some work to do here, because grief is definitely a different experience. As I've learned from my teacher, as I've learned from other professionals such as yourself who provide support to others in the form of writing and in the form of coaching, as well as grievers. They've just been great teachers in helping understand that grief is part of life. And it's sometimes just there really isn't anything to overcome or conquer. It's just something to be experienced.
Yeah, I read the other day something quite beautiful that said like we don't really, get over grief or overcome grief. We just learn to live with it differently. And I think that's what it is, isn't it? That does time heal all wounds? Who knows? But I think we get to live with it rather than overcome it and conquer it and things like that.
Right. Yeah. From my mentor, he uses the word befriending grief. And I really gravitate towards that because I'd never really perceived grief as my true friend. But at the same time, I'm like, the concept of befriending it is almost like what I said earlier about like inviting it to the space in order to feel through it, in order to gain deeper understandings if there's some heavy or very introspective thoughts related to it. I've always perceived grief as like a very important human and also spiritual teacher in my life. And so I just love having these types of conversations. So thanks again for being here.
No, I love it. I like the like-mindedness of it. And I do agree that, I like the idea of being a friend with grief because I think when we try and battle against it, we're never going to be friends, but it's probably always going to be there. So I like the befriending.
Awesome. Well, Shelley, let's get to know you a little bit more. Can you tell us a little bit about where you live to start off with?
Yeah, so I'm over here in the UK on a very windy day. um, Live in Northampton, right in the middle, in the Midlands, which is slightly ironic because actually I love the seaside and want to be on the coast. But yeah, I live here in the UK and I ended up in Northampton. I'd like to say by accident, but I do believe in synchronicity. But I came here to do my nursing degree many, many moons ago. And I said I'd do 1 year post student nurse, and that must have been 20 odd years ago, and I'm still here.
As is life, that often happens, right?
Yep, 1 year of my life, I said, and then I'm here with a husband and 4 children and a dog later, still craving that seaside life.
Does with the family, as it is, do you take trips to get to the seaside?
Seaside, lakes, forests, anywhere really. I do, I'm very blessed. I did leave nursing in 2019. So I now gone back to my first career of working in education. So I'm really blessed that we get school holidays like every 6 weeks. So yeah, we travel quite a bit.
Fantastic. Yeah. And it sounds like the family values nature. Is that correct?
Yeah, I find it really healing, even in those times when we think we've got nothing to heal. As a mother, I beg to differ. I think, like our eldest is doing his final school exams, others have done sort of in school exams. We're trying to get used to life after the pandemic, hormones, friendships. There's always something that needs a little bit of healing and time of self love. So, yeah, always get outside. I am one of those mums, though, that even if it's pouring rain and snowing, the children still have to go outside every day for at least 10 minutes. It just does something to the soul, as well as, the nursery bits like the respiratory system and things like that.
Mm.
Always get outside.
You're cracking me up because I heard you put together healing and hormones in some of the same contexts, and I've never thought of it that way before. But I'm like, oh, we definitely go through processes of healing hormones too. And my wife right now, she's dealing with some hormone stuff herself, and and I was like, how do I, as a partner or a family member, with some of the teenagers dealing with the hormones, how do you show up to support support others who perhaps are going through some hormone experiences and need some hormone healing? Such a
Yeah,
strange
no, you
thing.
do. I mean, like, I, yeah, no, it's true because there's always hormones. So I'm sort of nearing half a century, so I've got my own hormones going on. But then we've got like a teenage son, a teenager daughter who's like 11. So we've got a lot of hormones in our house. So yeah, get outside before the cabin fever kicks in.
I love it. Thank you. Thank you for being so transparent. It's fantastic. Shelley, you mentioned that you've come from a background in nursing, and I'm guessing that that's kind of how, at least professionally, you probably started looking at working with people that are grieving. Is that correct?
Yeah, I hesitate because when I went into nursing, it's not where I saw myself going to end up. But the universe knows what I'm doing for far more than I know myself. So I went into nursing in 2004, and then my beautiful stepdad died New Year's Day 2005. So I'd worked in acute medicine, which is a bit like one step down from A&E, so it's sudden onsets of illness, which can be cancers, heart attacks, things like that. And I loved the fast pace of it all, I really did. But when my beautiful stepdad died suddenly, my life turned upside down. It was really strange, awful, but kind of life affirming. So, we all grieve differently, and I grieve very deeply. I believe, like the deeper we love in life, the deeper that grief goes. And so my beautiful stepdad died, and it took me years to heal. But then there was this really strange thing, if I'm honest, Reed, that because my dad had died suddenly, I didn't get the chance to say goodbye and all those beautiful stories I wanted to share. So I then moved into hematology and chemotherapy and end of life nursing because I wanted to know, I don't know, would it have made a difference if I just had time to say goodbye? I wanted to make sure those that were losing people didn't feel like I did. So yeah, I hadn't thought of going into that line of work. But then when my beautiful stepdad died, I went into sort of, well, I was a chemotherapy nurse for many, many years. So that's how it all started, really. But then it was just like this big snowball, really. Like my dad died, then I was working with the dying. And all I can say, because people used to sort of look at me with pity, as in like, you poor cow, you must have been really horrible in a past life. Why do you do this work? But it was the most privileged job in the world to be with somebody that's had a life-changing experience of being given a diagnosis and recovering through chemotherapy, from working at the end of life, when they're sharing their life stories, their life experience, being with that family, trying to take away the pain, the most privileged job in the world. And even though I left nursing in 2019, I still will always have a place in my heart, the palliative medicine, the grieving, and for me, I mean, I work in schools now. My first career, I work with year sixes. So they're sort of like the last year of primary school. And even now I share the life lessons I learned from the dying with them, when they're having a bad day. It's like, be happier, speak your truth, and all those life lessons still come out. So yeah, I didn't go into nursing to work with, the dying or the grieving, because, when you go into nursing, it's very much an emphasis on healthcare, and you're meant to make everyone healthy and happy and live forever after. But that wasn't the reality. And it was kind of like a ripple effect, I guess, that when dad died, I was then exposed to more like patients dying, and like my friends, like parents would die. It was just like, I guess it was the path that I was meant to follow.
Fair enough. Yeah. I hear that, there's some things we just can't avoid in our lives. They keep showing up and pointing us in certain directions, especially in, the realm of helping with people with healing. Yeah, I can project some of my own experiences into some of your story and just really resonate with that. But hey, I'm picking up on something about you, and I can hear it in your voice. And you kind of got like this playful approach, like as a listener to you sharing more about who you are, I hear something of like kind of a lightness inside, the tone of your voice, and a genuine curiosity to life, and even in this case, death and grief. And so I was thinking, when you shared more about when you made some of that professional transition into more of like the palliative care role in as a nurse, I was like, there's probably this genuine curiosity to try to understand more to help you in some of your personal healing, with the loss of your stepfather. And if it's okay to ask, his name?
David, but
Hey,
well, yeah, David's a normal name, but he had really dark hair and he'd gone grey down the middle. So I always referred to him as Badger.
Badger. Okay, I'm also picking up on sense of humor is really prevalent in your family. Now, did David Badger own up to it? Did he just go with it, or was he like, "Hey, don't call me that"?
No, he was always jovial, no matter what happened in life. Like my mum was diagnosed with cancer the year before he died, actually. She got the all clear and he died a few weeks later. Because that's what life does, isn't it? It's like, why have one curveball when you can have two, Shelley? Um, and he used to, whatever he went through, like mum being diagnosed with cancer, me being dumped by a guy, he used to always say, it will be all right. No matter how horrific your life got, really, it always made it will be all right. And because of our warped humour in our family, it's actually on his headstone at his grave. He's got his name, and then quotation marks. He's got "It'll be all right," even though he's obviously dead and gone. There, it says it'll be all right because he probably still believes that on some kind of spiritual level.
I think that's wonderful. Yeah, I love the joyful approach into some of the experiences that are often labeled and categorized and even felt as heavier, more weighing in emotions. Where I was heading was as you transitioned professionally and worked into the palliative role, and to me, it sounded like there was a desire to learn more. I was wondering, were you scared to make that jump or to make that leap? Or was it always just this like kind of like, hey, I need to do this and trusting the process in it?
Yeah, it probably sounds really cliche if I'm honest, but it felt like going home, is all I can say. Like when I got on that ward and met those people, it was just beautiful. That real sense of knowing. I think, a great believer now that the universe has our back and that we're never truly alone. I've learned a lot. I've gone from very clinical into the spiritual over the years, but I just knew that's where I was meant to be, because normally you get that new job and you're a little bit anxious, but it was a sense of comfort that I got.
Thank you. Yeah, that's just really neat to hear coming home. That's powerful, very valuable. I've heard you, I've watched a few of your interviews that are on the internet, and I've heard you refer to yourself as a spiritual mentor. And, in some of what you just shared, it sounds like you have a really deep sense of trust, the universe having your back, kind of being like like an ally and navigating life. And so, as a spiritual mentor, I'm just curious, can you please share more about like how providing spiritual mentorship shows up in the work that you do?
Yeah, so I left nursing. It was just probably just like a couple of months before like COVID and the lockdown happened. But I'd changed quite a lot. Like not only did my beautiful stepdad die, but then my grandfather died, my grandmother died. I've had a horrific fertility journey, so we've lost lots of babies. It's been awful. And with each of those deaths, each of those comes a grief process. And I honestly think if I'd remained clinical, I don't know if I'd still be on the earthly plane. It would have been too much. So I would urge any listener today, like, always find something to believe in life, even if that's yourself, like self-belief, or your loved ones in spirit looking down on you, the universe having your back. Just always find something to believe in. So I was working clinically, but I just believed more spiritually. I was the wacky nurse that would have crystals in her pockets, if I was really tired, I'd call in different energies to help me. And then when I was with people at the end of their life, I become aware of like temperature changes in the room, a softening of the body. I could see sort of mists around them, when the family are there. Please disregard this if it doesn't resonate with you. But for me, I was there and I could see like, I knew the soul had left the body is what I'm trying to say. And so while you're there and you're grieving, and if your loved one is in discomfort or you feel that it's undignified, I've seen that they've already left that body. I think we've got, I do believe we're looked after by something more powerful and bigger than ourselves. So I was very spiritual, for want of a better word, and I just didn't really fit into that tick box of, giving the meds and putting up the fluids and all that clinical stuff. I wanted to be more the gentleness, like that we've got this continuum of life, this continuum of consciousness, and that's just where I was in the end. And that came, it's like what we said at the start, Reed, really, is that people want to zoom through grief or sticky plaster it. And you shouldn't, whilst it's going to be one of the most painful things in your life, it's probably going to be your greatest teacher, your best life lessons. And so, when my family members died, when I lost my children and things like that, the lessons took me down another path, from the clinical path to the spiritual path. So that's why I think, as you said earlier, like, always tap into your grief, because it will shape you and it will shape your life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. It just sounds like, to me as a listener to your sharing, it sounds like beautiful poetry. It almost kind of brings me to like a moment of pause so that I can reflect and let it sink in and just ruminate with it. So thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And then, but like, if you are in a coaching role and it's spiritually inclined, what are some of the things that you tend to focus on to help the mentees, especially the ones that are grieving?
I always try and bring them to the present. You always got to start where you're at. I know it sounds really obvious, but lots of people say, I want this career, I want this amount in the bank and things like that. And we know that we're unhappy in the now, but we don't, we get busy looking at the future. But I just start in the now. How are you feeling this morning? How are you doing today? What emotions coming up for you? Where do you feel it in your body? I think we're always sort of like hiding in the past, where we, everything was known, or we're zooming ahead to the future where it's unknown. And we do just start with where you're at. I use tools to sort of like rate key areas of their life with grief. I often get them to do a timeline, like a timeline therapy, because I'm a great believer that when we're grieving one thing, it's often because we've been through another thing. And what I mean by that is, I remember going to my husband's best friend's father's funeral, if you follow, and I got so upset, that my husband's friend's father had died, and I was sobbing like mad, totally like irrelevant levels of grief. But what it was like a secondary loss, that I'd been told I couldn't cry at my own father's funeral. And I think that's the thing, isn't it? That when we're meeting people in the now is really a consolidation of all the past events and things like that. So yeah, I sort of get people to look at a timeline, sort of like, where did you feel this before? Where did you first become aware of this? What other losses have you had in your life? What have you overcome? What are your coping skills? What works for you? And things like that. Because I think we give ourselves such a hard time. And for me, yeah, grief is absolutely like the death of a loved one. But as I say in my book, grief is the loss of anything with which we have an emotional connection. So if we look at the pandemic, yes, we lost a lot of loved ones, but we also lost like a daily routine, finances, jobs, freedom, lots of things. And I honestly believe so many of us in the world are grieving or going through a grief process and think we're going slightly mad, trying to make sense of it all. But I think we've all lost so much, not always death. And I think, everyone just needs to sort of stop, as they say, tap in. Where are you right now?
Awesome. So you mentioned the book. It's called Good Grief, the A to Z approach of modern day grief healing. And so thank you for distinguishing that. In your book, you define grief as something more, for lack of a better word, more comprehensive than just physical death related losses. A very large umbrella of grief related experiences. And so, as someone who has not read the book, I'm just so curious of like, how's the connection of what makes it modern day? Can you tell me like where that ties in?
Yeah, so I don't know how it is for you, but here in the UK, like, when someone does, if we talk of grief and loss of a loved one, when someone loses a loved one, there's very much that kind of mentality, like, oh, you'll never get over it, that's it, you're doomed. Um, or that's often contrasted with like a month or 3 months later, they'll be like, oh, you're still grieving. You know, there's like no in between. But generally with grief, there's always negative connotations like, oh, you're grieving, that's it, you'll never find love again, no one will replace that person, all those kind of things. But I find those quite outdated. And so I wanted people to know that it's okay if, you know, you lose someone, a loved one, sometimes an unloved one, you know, let's be honest, that it's okay to heal and get over it. You know, some people have really long episodes of grief. Some people have complex grief. There's like, when I was doing the research, like 17 different types of grief. When I did my nursing degree, there's like 3. But
Hmm.
now we have, you know, people are living longer with more conditions. So you've got that anticipatory grief. We have complex grief. We have, you know, condensed grief where people kind of, you know, don't feel grief like some of us do. They don't have all these prior things. So the modern day approach is to try things to try and heal. And it is anything from, you know, acupressure through to Z to sleeping better. It's things like decluttering. I believe in movement. So things like yoga, dance clubs. I swear by art, I really do. I've used art therapy with my own children. My auntie died. So it is like doing art, sound therapy, you know, redecorating the home, Netflix binge, read a book, journal. And it's just trying something new all the time rather than listening to society where they say you'll never get over it, or you need to have talking therapies, it's the only thing that works, or you need to have medication. It's so limited. And so I piled in, I don't know, about 150 tools for people to try. And that's why I thought it was modern. I mean, some of them are ancient tools. There's a slightly, you know, slight irony to it, really. But it's just modern in the fact that grief doesn't have to be a lifelong companion or something you're constantly battling. You know, you can work with it, overcome it, you know, understand it even, but certainly try and process it. Don't, you know, dampen it down.
Awesome. Thanks for explaining that. Yeah, I think that any resource such as your book that provides, you know, for lack of a better word, tips for guidance is just a helpful tool because so many times I've heard grievers say, I feel so lost. And so, you know, if there's something that is shown up as a guide or a roadmap, it's helpful. It really is. And I love that you know, holistically bring up what sounds like ideas and all different facets of ways of doing things, you know. Sounds like technology is a part of it too. Selfish question, did you mention anything about using apps?
No, I didn't. I did about like, you know, death cafes and online forums and things like that. But I have, you know, worked with apps since the book came out. So yeah, definitely do an app. But it's good, isn't it? Because it's there and it's in front of us. I did say sort of like meditation apps are certainly in there. But if we think about apps specifically for grief, then no. But
Fair
yes, you
enough.
should.
Yeah. Hopefully in the future, if there's a second
Yeah,
edition, perhaps there might be a mention of the Grief Refuge app, but
absolutely.
no, I'm kind of playing, but it's really neat to have, you know, information that helps provide that type of guidance. So thank you for writing it. You know, in my projection, Shelley, authors of books about grief, you know, there's something that happens in their lives that either inspires them or calls them, whatever the best word that resonates for you. It brings you to actually doing the act of writing the book and getting it published. So what's your experience? What's your story that brought you to, you know, the loss of Badger David, a lot of fertility losses in your life, loved ones that you probably haven't even told me about. But like, how did all this come together to get you to the place of authoring Good Grief?
So I was having a phone call with my 2 friends, Louise and Donna, and it was after I'd left nursing in 2019. And if I'm honest, I guess I had like a loss of identity. I'm sure people can relate to that. Like, you know, when you're a doctor, a nurse, or you've always done that job, like in a shoe factory for like years and years and years, when you don't have that, again, it's like a grief process. So I was trying to make sense, like, where do I go from here? I'm not a nurse, you know, I can't be a stay-at-home mum because all my children are at schools. So I was having this like coaching call with my girlfriends, and they said, well, why did you leave nursing? And it's the conversation we had earlier, a bit sort of like went in very clinical, you know, like I was a medical nurse on a busy ward. But I started to realise that we are more than our physical bodies. I knew the temperatures changed, the room softened, the soul was leaving and all that. And I said, I just didn't feel I could be in a clinical setting anymore. I wasn't being true to who I felt I was and who I was to become. And then I was like having this conference call on like Zoom. And then I looked at the camera and Louise and Donna were just frozen. And I was like, what? And they was like, why was that not your first book? And I was like, well, who's going to read that? And there's like, you'd help so many people, you know, because the clinical, you know, often people die in the clinical setting, but you're saying there's a spiritual aspect to that happening. You need to write the book. And so my first book, Positive Changes, a self-kick book, took like 4 years read, you know, partly because of imposter syndrome, but it took 4 years to write. It was really sticky. But good grief, when I spoke to Louise and Donna, it just poured onto the pages. And from starting the book to landing the first publishing house that it went to was 9 months. It was literally like my baby. So that's how it happened, that I was just, you know, having a conversation like, who am I if I'm not a nurse? And the rest of they say is history.
It sounds powerful. And coming back to what was mentioned earlier about the universe, it really sounds like the universe had your back on this one.
Yeah, it did, because it's with O Books. And if I look back to the 18 months before Good Grief came to be, loads of my friends were going like, oh my God, you should write a book for O Books. And I was like, really? Like, they're really cool. And that word came up so many times. And so, you know, you do your proposal, you send it out there, and it was O Books that snapped it up in the first week. So yeah, the universe is looking down on me. Good thing I behave, isn't it?
Right. Listen, respond, behave. Fantastic. Well, earlier in the conversation too, you mentioned two traits. I'm going to call them traits. I apologize if, you know, there's a different word that better resonates, but kind of two traits of some of the information that you help provide in Good Grief, such as be happier and live your truth. And so I really want to play devil's advocate for a hot second here about some of these concepts, because sometimes people that are grieving, they're just in the depths of their own despair, and the loss is so great, and it's just hard to see any possibility of something called hopeful, or something, you know, that would be happier. And speaking your truth, that definitely resonates, but I guess I'm tying into the happier piece. And so I kind of want to challenge you on this one for a second, Shelley, and ask if you're advocating for people to be happier in their grief, can you share a little bit more to help us understand how you would advocate for that?
Yeah, so I'm not telling any griever to be happier. Those traits, as you said, they were the life lessons I learned from the dying. So they're not to do with grief, they're just the way I live my life. So it's a very long title, Good Grief, the A to Z approach of modern day grief healing. The contents go in a certain order. So I actually start with life. So I start talking about life, define what life is, life lessons and life stages. And so that's where they come in. They come in at the start when I'm saying, what's life really about? Why are we here? What have I learned? And so those words are be happier, connect to something bigger than yourself, speak your truth, do more of what you love, and live your life. And they are what I learned from his amazing, like 24-year-old patient that I had that sadly passed, right up to like the 90-year-olds. Slightly different wording, but always those things like allow yourself to be happier. And it was kind of generational, but people used to sort of like marry the girl they had to in the village because they got her pregnant, or they had to marry that person because it was the same class. So that, you know, be happier Like sometimes something funny will happen and we don't laugh. We think, we sort of like hold it in. So yeah, be happier. The connect to something bigger than yourself can absolutely be God. For me, it's the universe, but it can just be like volunteering in your local community. If the loved one that died, you could go on to fundraise for that charity, but always, I think it just means stop being selfish. Do you know what I mean? Always connect to something. That whole thing I said earlier. Always find something to believe in, whether it's yourself or something bigger. Now, just to clarify, speak your truth doesn't mean going out and getting really angry and shouting at people. It just means that everyone's words are valid. So say I had a row with someone, or like, what would you say, like a disagreement, that kind of rumbling that things need to be said. If someone's like ranting away at me, I will listen, but then I expect them to listen to me, not because I'm right and they're wrong, just because, our words are valid. And so many dying patients told me things they wish they'd said years ago. They didn't want the designer shoes, they didn't want the designer car, they wanted to find that estranged daughter, that estranged wife, that person they hurt, and just speak their truth. And so that's really important. But I think what's really important is that we say those words, we speak our truth in life, not in death, really. Do more of what you love is exactly that. Again, it's not about the money, the designer shoes, how many houses you own. It is sort of like, splashing in muddy puddles, drinking on the weekend, I don't know, going for walks, walking the dog, dancing your pants off, do what you like, but do more of what you love. And I was like 32 when like Badger died. And so I felt quite young then, because I'm quite old now by comparison. But they used to just say, especially the old boys, they used to say, like, just live your life, Shelley, live your life. And you have to. We always say when we've got £5,000 in the bank, or we've got that level of qualification. And it's not, just stop, because that's not living your life, is it? It's almost like you're saving your life. So yeah, live your life. So yeah, they're not traits for grief. They are the start of the Good Grief book, where it's the life lessons about being happier, true to yourself, getting the words out while you're still alive, and things like that.
Okay, thank you for the distinction. That's very helpful. That makes sense. Okay, powerful things to help pay more attention to, and very liberating, if I can project for a second, extremely liberating to, allow oneself to give that sense of permission to actually feel things that, bring more joy into the experience of life. Shelley, when creating a book, there's probably a targeted audience. And so, like, if anything, there's an ideal person who were to pick up your book and say, look at the title and say, hey, this is a must read for me. Can you tell us a little bit more about who that person might be?
So obviously it would be for a griever, one that's probably open-minded to new ways of healing. So, not just the talking therapies, because as we've gathered so far, I like to talk, but even I didn't use talking therapies when Badger died. So yeah, for the griever, but I would have loved this book when I was a student nurse, when I'm going into that clinical training. And so I wrote it very much for the supporters as much as the person as well. Because as I said, when I did my nursing training, there were 3 types of grief. There was sort of like normal grief, absent grief, or delayed grief, which means you either were grieving, wasn't grieving, or you would in the future. And there's now 17 or 18 different types of grief. We're living longer with more conditions, we have that anticipation, but there wasn't a book to really help me. Like I said, the healthcare had such a huge emphasis on the health. We couldn't let any of our patients possibly die. Yeah, so I would say it's very much for anyone that's working in a clinical setting and wants to soften how they help people. So yeah, the grievers or those supporting grievers. I think you probably need an openness to spirituality or new ways of healing, because it's a little bit out there. I remember getting really uncomfortable just before it published, thinking, oh my goodness, my nursing career, I'm this clinical go-to person, because it was a little bit woo woo, I think some people would call it. But to me, it's important, that we try. I always say, like, just 10 minutes a day to tap into yourself, just be alone with yourself in silence. And it's quite an uncomfortable place to be, but there's so many tools in there. Just sit 10 minutes every day, whether you're grieving or just if you're alive, and just see what comes up for you. But I'm a curious soul, so I'd always try new things. But yeah, the griever or those supporting, if you're reading the book, you could go around and do a weepy film with your friends, get them out for the yoga and the sound healing and things like that. Or if you are the griever reading it, the tools are there.
So out of the tools that you've put in your book, what would you say is your personal favorite?
Ooh, it'd have to be. I mix and match. I have a really not strict, but quite a regular daily routine, and I do like to do like the journaling, the oracle cards. I swear by meditation. I honestly do. I do it every single night. So I would always go for the sort of spiritual things. But I think, if all else fails, I just believe, as long as people don't press it down, I don't care what tool they do. But when they just sort of like carry on just handing, not being truthful to themselves, trying to carry on, stiff upper lip, as we say here in the UK, don't do that. But yeah, I like the simple things. Do you know what I mean? You don't
Mm-hmm.
need to turn grief into a full-time job. You can just like journal for 10 minutes, do a guided meditation on YouTube for 10 minutes, go for a 10-minute walk, But I honestly believe it makes such a big difference.
It sure does. Yes, that's the motivation for Grief Refuge and our mission and the product we've created. Just to make sure that somebody has, I like your word, a tool accessible on a very consistent basis, so that it's available to use when they need it. Because sometimes grief hits us in moments where it's least expected. So I'm grateful that you've wrote your book, and I'm unfamiliar with the publisher, but it sounds like it's a successful publisher. So congratulations on that partnership. That's wonderful news. Okay, Shelley, so I want to thank you so much for sharing more about your own personal experience and sharing more about the tools that are provided in your book, Good Grief. We're going to say goodbye for now, but I just have to ask, if there were, this is kind of like my parting question that I ask a lot of people on Grief Refuge podcast. So if there was something that, you saw yourself in the grief journey or the grief experience that you were an advocate for, and in 3 years from now, you'd like to see this part of the grief journey or the grief experience different, what would you name it?
Oh, probably something like griefhood. Like you have brotherhood and sisterhood and things like that. I think I'd have griefhood. So I say that because when we went into lockdown here in the UK, obviously there was a lot of loss. There's a lot of, loss of sort of like finances, jobs, but also loved ones and things like that. And I become hyper aware that once upon a time nurse, that people needed support, people needed to feel heard and safe and secure. So I set up a death cafe, like a grief cafe. It's called Good Grief Northampton Death Cafe. And it was just a space where people could come and talk about grief, because I have no discomfort around death, dying, grief, and things like that. And it's that sense of like, you are not alone. And so these people come together, and they might have like had a child that died, a mother that died, a partner that died. But there was that sense of connectedness. And I think, when we're in our pain, that's all we know. But when we start to, go out to these places, these online forums, obviously the Grief Refuge app and things like that, we're not alone. And so I would create probably a griefhood, that sort of support network. I think is brilliant, so powerful. And, I'd love people to have that realization that you're not alone. And I know grief, it can be the loneliest place, the loneliest feeling, but yeah, griefhood, where there's always someone you can connect with.
Sounds like a great concept and a great experience, and the universe has got your back on it.
Absolutely. Watch this space.
Yeah. Shelley, this has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for being on the Grief Refuge podcast.
Oh, no, thank you. It's been my absolute honor to meet you and be able to share my words with your listeners. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for listening to the full interview. I'm deeply grateful for your trust in Grief Refuge and all the stories and the experiences shared here on this podcast. Grief and healing, it's very important work. And although it's painful at times, it's worth it for helping to heal your heart, your mind, and your soul. And remember that if you need more support, download the Grief Refuge app. It's that daily companion specifically made to help comfort and support you through the difficult journey. Search and find Grief Refuge on your phone's App Store now. Also, please leave a rating and review for this podcast. Your feedback, it's deeply valued, and we listen to it. We want to make sure that the Grief Refuge podcast has the best resources for you and serves your needs. So the more you let us know through leaving a review, the better we can provide. Please rate and review the Grief Refuge podcast on your favorite podcast player. Thank you. Take care. Keep honoring your grief. Keep listening to your heart. Please be kind to yourself and talk to you soon.